the stain that spoke louder than words. The glass of grape juice flew straight toward my white dress. The deep purple liquid splashed across the fabric, spreading like a mark of humiliation for everyone to see. Skylar Dri, my own 8-year-old granddaughter, stood frozen for a second, her mischievous grin giving away what she'd just done. The silence in the living room lasted barely 2 heartbeats before laughter erupted. "Skylar, you are terrible," my daughter-in-law, Tanisha Hayes Dupree, shrieked between bursts of laughter. But there wasn't a trace of reprimand in her tone. If anything, she seemed proud of what her daughter had done. My son, Marcus, tried to cover his mouth to hide his amusement, but the sparkle in his eyes betrayed him. Around the room, the other guests chuckled, whispering comments they thought I couldn't hear. I sat there, still, my heart sinking beneath the laughter. Then Skylar leaned closer, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Mommy said you don't belong here," she murmured with that false innocence only a child can wear when taught by someone cruel. Her words echoed in my ears like Sunday church bells, loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. Tanisha didn't deny it. She just kept laughing, slicing another piece of cake, as if humiliating a 64-year-old woman was part of the party's entertainment. I stayed seated, clutching my napkin in silence, realizing the stain on my dress wasn't the only thing that wouldn't wash away. It was as if my pain had become part of their celebration. Every laugh, every raised glass, every cheerful shout reminded me that I was invisible, except when I could be the punchline. I stood at the sink, staring at my reflection in the small window above it. The woman staring back looked older than I remembered, not because of her age, but because of the weight of years spent trying to earn love from people who had none to give. My fingers, still stained purple, clenched around the towel. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I thought of all the birthdays I'd attended, the ones where I brought gifts, offered help, and smiled even when my heart ached. I remembered how I'd cooked, cleaned, and cared for each of them when they needed me. Yet somehow, I had become the joke in the room. I took one last look at my ruined dress. The grape stain had spread, but strangely, it no longer bothered me. It was just fabric, and fabric could be replaced. What couldn't be replaced was the years I had wasted trying to belong where I was never welcome. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked back through the kitchen door, not to rejoin the party, but to leave it behind. Marcus saw me first. His laughter faltered when he noticed my purse in my hand. "Mom, where are you going?" he asked, half concerned, half embarrassed. I met his eyes, calm and steady. "Home," I said simply. Tanisha's smirk didn't fade. "Already? But we were just getting started," she said with that sweet venom that dripped from every word. "I know," I replied. "That's exactly why I'm leaving." The room fell quiet, not out of guilt, but from surprise. They weren't used to me standing up for myself. I turned and walked toward the door. My heart was heavy, but for the first time in years, it was mine again, not something for them to play with. As I stepped outside, the night air met my skin, cool and forgiving. The stars above shimmered softly, as if the universe itself was whispering that I had finally done the right thing. I got into my car, looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, and smiled faintly. The stain on my dress no longer looked like shame. It looked like freedom. That night, as I drove away from the laughter, I promised myself one thing. I would never again beg for a seat at a table where my presence was only meant to be mocked. While I waited, I would sit in the living room, clutching my purse on my lap like a visitor instead of a mother. Tanisha would float around me, her perfume sharp and her smile sharper, making polite small talk that carried no warmth. Marcus would check his phone or disappear into the kitchen, avoiding any real conversation. Skylar would pass by me without a glance, too absorbed in her tablet to even say hello. I would try to offer help, set the table, wash a few dishes, make conversation, but every attempt was brushed off. "It's okay, Mom, we've got it," Marcus would say. Or worse, Tanisha would look at me and add, "You just relax, Essie. We don't want you to tire yourself out," as if being useful were some kind of offense. When dinner finally began, I would sit quietly, listening to stories about their friends, their jobs, their vacations, all topics that didn't include me. They laughed at inside jokes, shared glances across the table, and sometimes I caught Tanisha watching me, as though waiting for me to say something she could twist into ridicule. After dessert, I would stand to help clear the plates, but Tanisha would always wave her hand. "No, really, don't worry about it. We'll take care of everything." And so I would sit again, invisible. I used to cry in the car on the way home, but over time, the tears stopped. They were replaced by a quiet, aching numbness. That night, driving home in my stained dress, I realized how much of my life I had spent chasing their approval, as if love were a prize I could earn through patience, gifts, or good manners. I had mistaken endurance for strength. But strength doesn't mean staying where you're unloved. It means knowing when to leave. When I reached my apartment, I parked the car and sat there for a long moment in the dark. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It felt like peace. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone to call or apologize or ask me to come back. I walked inside, took off the ruined dress, and folded it neatly before placing it in a plastic bag. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. It wasn't just fabric. It was a reminder. A symbol of everything I had finally decided to let go of. I brewed myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. And then, for the first time in years, I said it out loud. I deserve better. The words hung in the air like a prayer, or perhaps a promise. The next morning, I made a decision. I called the community center a few blocks away and asked about their volunteer programs. I'd seen the flyers before, but never thought I had the time. Now I did. Within a week, I was helping out at the after-school program, reading to children, helping them with homework, and sometimes just listening when they needed someone who cared. They called me Miss Essie, and they smiled when they saw me. Genuine smiles. I hadn't realized how much I had missed being seen. Every afternoon, as I walked home, I felt lighter. The loneliness began to fade, replaced by something new, purpose. And though my family never called, I no longer checked my phone waiting for them to. Because for the first time in my life, I understood something I should have known all along. Family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes, it's the ones who make you feel like you matter. "You won't have to worry about a thing," she said, smiling that polished, practiced smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her eyes. I hesitated. Something inside me whispered that it was a bad idea, that I should say no. But then Marcus placed his hand over mine and said softly, "Mom, please. You're the only one we can count on." And just like that, I signed. For the next 5 years, I paid for that signature, not just in dollars, but in sleepless nights and endless anxiety. When the mortgage fell behind, the bank didn't call them first. They called me. I remember sitting in my small living room, listening to the cold, official voice on the phone tell me that my credit was at risk, that my name, the one I had worked so hard to keep clean, was tied to a debt I hadn't created. When I finally confronted Marcus, he brushed it off. "Mom, calm down. You're overreacting. We'll handle it." They never did. That was the beginning of the distance between us. Not because I stopped loving him, but because every time I looked at my son, I no longer saw the little boy who used to hold my hand while crossing the street. I saw a man who had learned that his mother's love was something he could spend, and that she'd always forgive him for it. But tonight, something had snapped. As I sat in my car outside my apartment, I realized I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I had already been alone, surrounded by people who called me family, but treated me like a stranger. The grape juice stain on my dress had dried, turning from bright purple to a deep, almost black mark, like an old wound finally scabbed over. I turned off the ignition and leaned back in my seat. The silence was deafening, but it was also peaceful. No laughter mocking me from another room, no voices talking over me, no fake smiles pretending to care. Just quiet. Honest, beautiful quiet. That night, I slept better than I had in years. In the morning, I called my boss at the office and told her I was retiring. She sounded surprised, even concerned, but I reassured her it was the right decision. I didn't tell her that my retirement wasn't about age. It was about reclaiming time. My own time. I spent that first week clearing out my apartment. Old photos, gifts from Marcus and Tanisha, trinkets that once meant something. One by one, I placed them in boxes, not out of anger, but closure. Each item carried a story, and I was ready to stop rereading the same sad chapters. A few days later, I passed by a small bakery near the park. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon pulled me inside. The owner, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, smiled and said, "You look like someone who could use a little sweetness today." For the first time in a long while, I laughed a real laugh. We talked for an hour, and by the time I left, she had offered me a part-time job helping with orders and decorating pastries. It wasn't much money, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about belonging. Each day that followed, I felt myself growing lighter. The ache in my chest eased with every tray of muffins I placed in the display, every conversation with customers who saw me, really saw me. I even started volunteering at the local library on weekends, reading stories to children whose parents worked long hours. Their small hands and bright eyes reminded me of what love was supposed to feel like, uncalculated, unearned, real. And sometimes, late at night, when I sat by my window with a cup of tea, I thought about Marcus and Tanisha. Not with bitterness, but with understanding. Some people don't realize the value of love until it's no longer offered freely. They had taken my kindness for granted, but in doing so, they had freed me from the illusion that I needed their acceptance to be whole. Now, when I looked at my reflection, I didn't see an old woman who had been humiliated. I saw a survivor, a woman who had given everything and still had something left to give, herself. ChatGPT said, "Contact." The house was full of guests, Tanisha's friends, their children, neighbors I didn't recognize. But no one greeted me as family. I was just another body in the room, another obligation they couldn't avoid inviting. "Essie, you can put those over there," Tanisha said, pointing toward a small table near the door where a pile of gifts had already begun to stack up. Her tone was polite enough to pass for courtesy, but her eyes made it clear I was in the way. I forced a smile, nodded, and set the gifts down carefully, arranging them so the golden wrapping would catch the light. Skylar ran past me in a pink dress, laughing with a group of children. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I called out, my voice bright and warm. She stopped for half a second, turned her head, and gave me a quick wave, the kind of distracted acknowledgement a child gives to a stranger who happens to know their name, before dashing off again. It stung, but I told myself she was just excited. Children are like that, I reasoned. The party was loud and cheerful, full of laughter and chatter. I stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a glass of water, trying to look as though I belonged. Nobody approached me. The conversations flowed around me, just as they always did. Lively, full of shared jokes and stories that had no space for my presence. When it was time to open gifts, everyone gathered in the living room. I took a seat at the edge of the sofa, my heart beating fast. Skylar began tearing open packages, dolls, clothes, a new tablet from Tanisha's parents. The guests oohed and awed as she squealed with delight. Then she reached my pile. "What's this one, Mommy?" Skylar asked. "Oh, that's from Grandma Essie," Tanisha said with a dismissive smile, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see what Grandma brought." Skylar opened the first box, one of the miniature stables. Then another, a tiny horse, and another, the little saddles. The dollhouse came last. When the final box was opened, revealing the full set, a hush fell over the room. For a moment, I thought it was admiration. Then Tanisha laughed. "Oh my God, Mom, this must have taken you forever," she said, glancing at the guests. "It's so vintage." "How sweet." The word vintage hung in the air like a soft insult. One of her friends giggled. "It's cute. Kind of old-fashioned, though. Kids these days prefer digital toys, don't they?" The laughter spread, polite, restrained, but unmistakably cruel. Skylar wrinkled her nose. "It's okay," she said flatly, then turned to the next box, tearing into the wrapping of a brand new gaming console. The room erupted in cheers again, the dollhouse forgotten where it sat, golden paper glinting under the lights. I sat perfectly still, my smile frozen, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The noise around me blurred, muffled, as if I were sinking underwater. That was the moment something inside me broke, quietly, without drama, like a thread snapping after years of strain. I realized I had spent my life mistaking tolerance for love. I had traded my self-respect for brief moments of acknowledgement that never lasted. When the cake was brought out, I slipped away to the bathroom. I locked the door, looked at myself in the mirror, and saw a woman who had spent 63 years trying to prove she deserved the very thing that should have been freely given: kindness. After the party ended, no one offered me leftovers. No one thanked me for coming. I picked up the untouched dollhouse from the corner, now slightly bent from where a child had stepped on it, and carried it to my car. That night, I sat in bed staring at the pieces of the broken toy, and I promised myself it would be the last time I would allow them to humiliate me. And so, when Skylar threw that grape juice at me a year later, it wasn't just the dress that stained. It was the last bit of illusion I still had left. That was the night I stopped being afraid of losing my family. Because the truth was, I had already lost them long ago. Case well from the many times I had called to cover their missed payments. "Mrs. Dupree," he greeted me, his tone polite but cautious. "What can I do for you today?" "I'd like to discuss the process of removing my name as co-signer on the Elmwood Avenue property," I said clearly. There was a brief silence on the line, followed by the sound of papers being shuffled. "Ma'am, you do understand that if we proceed with that, your son and daughter-in-law will be solely responsible for the mortgage. If they fail to meet the payments, foreclosure will be unavoidable." "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I'm aware of the risks. But I'm no longer willing to assume responsibility for something that's no longer my home or my concern." Mr. Sterling hesitated. "It's unusual, Mrs. Dupree. Most parents prefer to protect their family, even under difficult circumstances." "I've done enough protecting," I said softly. "It's time for them to protect themselves." When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, listening to the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. Every second that passed seemed to echo a lifetime of decisions I had made for everyone except myself. At precisely 3 o'clock, I arrived at Silas Jenkins's office. The old man greeted me with a kind smile, offering me a seat across from his desk. "I reviewed the documents," he said, adjusting his glasses. "You have every legal right to request withdrawal, though the consequences for Marcus and Tanisha will be severe." The bank could initiate foreclosure within 60 days if they cannot refinance under their own credit. I nodded. That's fine. I've made my peace with it. He leaned forward slightly. Estelle, I've known you for years. You're not a vindictive woman. Are you sure this is what you want? It's not revenge, Silas, I said, my voice steady. It's liberation. I've spent the last decade sacrificing everything, money, time, pride, to be part of a family that never really wanted me. They used my love like an open checkbook. And now, for once, I'm going to love myself enough to stop. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I'll prepare the necessary documents and contact the bank on your behalf. As I signed the withdrawal paperwork that afternoon, I felt something inside me release, a weight that had been sitting on my chest for years. I walked out of Silas's office into the crisp afternoon air feeling lighter, taller, freer. That evening, I turned off my phone and made myself a simple dinner, soup and toast, the kind of meal that once would have felt lonely, but now felt peaceful. I slept soundly for the first time in months. The next morning, when I turned my phone back on, I found 12 missed calls and 6 voicemails, all from Marcus. The first one was angry. Mom, what the hell did you do? The bank called us this morning. The second was desperate. You can't do this, Mom. We'll lose the house. The third was pleading. Please, just call me back. We'll talk, okay? I didn't answer. For years, I had been the one to fix every problem, to pay every debt, to apologize for things that weren't my fault. But not this time. 2 weeks later, I received a formal notice from the bank confirming my removal from the mortgage agreement. Marcus and Tanisha would either have to refinance the house under their own names or vacate the property. They called me again, of course. Tanisha even came to my doorstep once, with Skylar standing behind her. Essie, think about your granddaughter, she said, her voice trembling between anger and manipulation. I looked at Skylar, the same little girl who had laughed when the grape juice ran down my dress, and for the first time, I didn't feel pain or resentment. I felt clarity. I am thinking about her, I said softly. I'm thinking about the kind of example I want to set. That no woman should ever let herself be treated like she doesn't matter. Tanisha's mouth fell open, but I simply closed the door. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. My house was quiet. No laughter, no noise, no chaos. Just peace. And for the first time in my life, I realized that peace is far more valuable than any family approval or false affection. I hadn't lost my family. They had lost me. ChatGPT said, "Never do that to us, right?" I took a slow breath, letting his words settle in the air before responding. It's not a mistake, Marcus. I asked the bank to begin the process 3 weeks ago. There was a stunned silence on the other end. I could almost hear him trying to find the right words, the kind that had always worked on me before. Mom, you don't understand. If you do this, they'll call the full balance. We'll lose the house. His voice cracked, not from sadness, but from panic. I understand perfectly, I said evenly. I've been understanding for years. I understood when you lost your job and didn't tell me until the bank called. I understood when you needed help with the air conditioning and with Skylar's school and with the kitchen I wasn't even invited to see. I understood every time you said you'd pay me back and never did. But I don't have anything left to give you, Marcus. Not money, not time, not excuses. He was silent for a long time. Then his voice came back, trembling with disbelief. But we're family. Yes, I said softly. And family doesn't use one another until there's nothing left. He started to say something else, a plea, maybe, but I hung up. My hand shook slightly, but not from guilt. It was the tremor of release, the shock of finally putting an end to a lifetime of being taken for granted. Over the next few days, the calls came nonstop from Marcus, from Tanisha, even from Tanisha's mother, who called to tell me I was ruining my own son's life. I let them all go to voicemail. The only call I answered was from Mr. Sterling, who confirmed that the bank had accepted the withdrawal request and had issued a formal notice. Unless Marcus and Tanisha refinanced within 45 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. On the 10th day, there was a knock on my door. It was Tanisha, with Skylar standing beside her. Tanisha's face was blotchy from crying, but her voice was still laced with accusation. "How could you do this, Essie?" she demanded. "Do you have any idea what this means for Skylar? She'll lose her home, her school, her friends." I looked at Skylar, her big brown eyes wide and uncertain, and for a moment, my heart ached. But then I remembered that same little girl's mocking laughter at the birthday party, the grape juice sliding down my new dress, the way Tanisha had smiled from across the room. "I'm sorry, Skylar," I said gently, "but sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and we have to learn from them." Then, looking at Tanisha, I added, "Maybe it's time you both learned that actions have consequences, financial and otherwise." Tanisha glared at me. "You'll regret this." "No," I said quietly. "For the first time, I really won't." When they left, slamming the door behind them, I sat in silence for a long time. There were tears in my eyes, but they weren't of sadness. They were of release. A month later, I received a final letter from the bank confirming that the foreclosure process had begun. Marcus and Tanisha had failed to refinance. They would have to vacate the house within 30 days. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply filed the letter in my cabinet and made myself another cup of coffee. A week after that, a small envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note in Marcus's handwriting. "I'm sorry, Mom. You were right. I didn't understand until now what you did for us. We'll figure it out. I just hope someday you can forgive me." I read it twice, then placed it in the same box where I kept Robert's letters, not out of nostalgia, but closure. That evening, I took a walk through the park near my house. The air was cool, the leaves beginning to fall, and for the first time in decades, I felt no fear of what came next. I didn't have much money left, but I had peace, and peace, I realized, is something no one can take from you. When I got home, I looked around my small, quiet house. Every corner, every crack, every bit of peeling paint, it was mine. Paid for by me, lived in by me, and finally protected by me. For the first time in years, I whispered out loud, "I'm free." "It's about Marcus," Brenda repeated, lowering her voice. I set my cup down, my fingers tightening around the handle. "What about him?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that tells you the next words will change everything. "I can't say much over the phone," Brenda whispered. "Please, can you meet me at the coffee shop near the old office around noon? I don't want to get anyone in trouble." Her voice trembled, and I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. "All right," I said quietly. "Noon it is." When I arrived, Brenda was already there, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her eyes darted toward the window every few seconds, as if expecting someone to burst in. "Mrs. Stell," she began softly, "I don't know how to say this, but I think you deserve to know the truth. The reason Marcus was fired from the company wasn't because of budget cuts like he told you." I didn't say a word. I simply waited. "He was let go for embezzlement," Brenda continued, voice shaking. "He had been using company accounts to pay personal bills, mortgage payments, credit cards, even online gambling. The company didn't press charges because the owner knew your family and didn't want to ruin your lives. But it was bad. They made him repay part of it, and that's when I think he took another loan under someone else's name to cover it." My heart sank. I had suspected Marcus was hiding something, but not this. Brenda reached into her purse and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. I shouldn't have this, but when I saw your name on the co-signer documents, I realized you were being pulled into something without your knowledge. These are copies of some of the transactions Marcus made using your information. I opened the paper, and there it was, my name, my signature forged, and a series of withdrawals tied to accounts I had never opened. He's been using your credit for years, Mrs. Stell, Brenda said, almost in tears. He even opened a line of credit in your name after he was fired. I don't think Tanisha knows everything, but she must have noticed something. For a moment, the world went silent. The sounds of the cafe faded, the clinking cups, the hum of conversation, the distant hiss of the espresso machine. I had spent years defending Marcus, believing he was simply irresponsible, maybe immature, but not this. This was deliberate, calculated. Thank you, Brenda, I said finally, my voice low and steady. You did the right thing. When I stepped out of the cafe, the cold wind hit my face like a slap. But beneath the shock, there was something else, clarity. They hadn't just taken my money or my kindness. They had stolen my name. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by bills, statements, and photocopies. I made a list, not of debts, but of decisions. Tomorrow, I would call the bank's fraud department. I would contact an attorney, and I would file a police report. For 6 years, I had carried their mistakes like they were my own. Not anymore. Leonard's words echoed in my mind long after I hung up the phone. He offered me $500 to lie for him. That was the final thread snapping in a web I hadn't even known I was caught in. The image of my son, the little boy who used to bring me hand-drawn cards on Mother's Day, dissolved completely. What remained was a man capable of deceit, threats, and betrayal without hesitation. I spent that night sitting at my kitchen table again, the folder from Brenda open in front of me, surrounded by coffee cups and legal pads. Each name, each number, each amount stolen, all of it documented, no longer just suspicions. For years, I had blamed myself for being too soft, too forgiving, too willing to help. But as I looked at those forged invoices and falsified signatures, something inside me hardened into resolve. I was done being the victim. The next morning, I walked into the branch office of the bank on Elmwood Avenue, the same one where I had once begged for extensions and pleaded for mercy on Marcus's behalf. This time, my posture was different. I was no longer there to protect him. I was there to protect myself. "Good morning, Miss Dupree," David said, standing when he saw me. His expression was polite, cautious. "Did you receive the documentation I sent?" "I did," I replied. "And I need to file an additional report, a fraud report." His eyes widened slightly. "Fraud." I opened the folder and began laying out the copies Brenda had given me, one after another, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "These invoices," I said, "these forged time cards, and this falsified loan application all point to a pattern of fraudulent behavior. Marcus has been using my name and credit history without authorization. I'm done covering for him." David's professionalism faltered for just a second. He looked from the papers to my face, then back again. "Miss Dupree, if what you're saying is true, the bank will have to initiate an internal investigation, and you may need to contact law enforcement." "I intend to," I said firmly. That afternoon, I sat in a quiet office at the local police station, speaking with Detective Morales, a woman in her 50s who looked like she had seen every kind of family tragedy there was. When I handed her the folder, she flipped through the pages slowly, her brow tightening. "This is serious, ma'am," she said at last. "If your son forged these documents or opened accounts under your name, that's identity theft. Do you want to press charges?" The question hung heavy in the air. Do I want to press charges against my own son? For a long moment, I couldn't answer. I thought of Skylar, of Tanisha, of the holidays that would never be the same again. But then I remembered the note taped to my door. Last chance, you crazy old woman, and the scratches on my car spelling egoist. Yes, I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. I want to press charges. Morales nodded. We'll start with a formal statement. If what you've shown me checks out, we'll open an investigation. I'll need copies of your financial records for the past 3 years. As I began recounting everything, from the first late payment to the forged invoices, I felt a strange calm settling over me. It wasn't peace, exactly, but something stronger. A sense that I was finally standing up for the woman I had allowed to disappear under everyone else's needs. When I returned home that evening, the sun was setting behind the buildings, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and violet. I sat by the window, watching the light fade, and whispered to myself, "It ends now." And for the first time in years, I felt like I was telling the truth, not to anyone else, but to myself. The invoices you forged, the fake overtime sheets, and the lies you told your old boss, all of which I now have in writing, with witnesses ready to testify. Marcus froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The two men glanced at each other, sensing that the situation had shifted in a direction they hadn't expected. You think you can threaten me, Marcus? I continued, my voice steady now. You think you can send men to scare me into silence? You have no idea how far I've already gone. Mom, he said finally, his voice tight and low, you don't know what you're getting into. These guys are leaving, I interrupted.
Right now.
I took a step closer, holding my phone up like a shield. Because if they don't, I'll make a call that'll ruin more than your mortgage, Marcus. I'll destroy every lie you've built your life on. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the faint hum of traffic on the distant road. Then, slowly, Alfred muttered something under his breath and tugged on Manny's arm. Come on, man. This isn't worth it, he said, glaring briefly at Marcus before walking toward a black SUV parked nearby. Manny followed, his grin fading as they drove off, leaving Marcus standing alone under the flickering parking light. You've been talking to someone, he said finally, his tone shifting from cold to pleading. Who gave you those papers? Someone with a conscience, I replied. Something you lost a long time ago. He took a step toward me, but I didn't flinch this time. The fear I'd carried for years. Fear of being unloved, of being alone, of losing what little family I had left, had vanished. What stood in its place was clarity. Mom, you're ruining everything, he shouted. Do you even understand what you're doing? Yes, I said quietly. For the first time in my life, I do. He stared at me for a long time, his eyes burning with anger and confusion. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away into the shadows of the parking lot. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew what was coming next. Marcus would realize that intimidation wouldn't work. And when that failed, he'd turn to manipulation again. So I spent the night preparing. I made copies of every document, every statement, every piece of evidence. I placed one set in my desk, another in Silas's office, and a third in a safe deposit box at the bank. If anything happened to me, I wanted the truth to outlive me. The next morning, I woke up to a strange silence. No calls, no threats, no vandalism. It was as if a storm had finally passed. But deep down, I knew better. The quiet wasn't peace. It was the calm before the reckoning. And I was ready for it. Placed the thick binder of documents on the table and opened it deliberately. We have detailed bank records, wire receipts, and written agreements proving that my client has paid over $43,000 in direct financial assistance to the plaintiffs over the past 6 years, including mortgage payments, school fees, and vacation expenses. She has never once been repaid. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet shuffle of papers. Silas continued, his voice calm but edged with iron. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have multiple sworn statements and corroborating documents from former colleagues of Mr. Marcus DRI confirming a pattern of fraudulent financial behavior. These include falsified invoices, forged overtime sheets, and falsified income statements used to secure loans, one of which, we believe, is the very mortgage under dispute. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Tanisha's face lost its composed mask, and Marcus's hand twitched nervously against a table. Judge Thorne raised an eyebrow. Mr. Jenkins, are you suggesting that the plaintiff obtained his home loan under false pretenses? Yes, Your Honor, Silas replied, sliding a folder forward. And we have documentation from the original bank officer, Mr. David Sterling, who has already submitted an affidavit confirming that portions of the original loan application were inconsistent with verified income records. My client, Ms. DRI, co-signed this loan in good faith, unaware of the falsifications her son had made. Mr. Trevino quickly stood, his voice tight. Your Honor, this is character assassination. These alleged documents were never verified through a proper chain of custody. The judge raised her hand, silencing him. Mr. Trevino, if your clients submitted falsified financial statements to a bank, that is not character evidence, that is criminal evidence. I will allow it. Silas continued, his tone steady. In addition, Your Honor, we have multiple witnesses, including Brenda Miller and Patrice Washington, who are prepared to testify that Marcus DRI not only engaged in workplace fraud but also boasted about manipulating his mother into signing the mortgage. He described her, in his own words, as easy to control because she's afraid of losing her family. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tanisha's head whipped toward Marcus, her expression equal parts fury and disbelief. Marcus stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Judge Thorne leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. Mr. Jenkins, do you have evidence that Ms. DRI's financial assistance to the plaintiffs was coerced or solicited under false pretenses? Silas nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We have text messages and emails, all authenticated, showing repeated requests for money, each escalating in tone from, help us, we're struggling, to you owe this to your granddaughter. The emotional manipulation is unmistakable. The judge turned her gaze toward Marcus and Tanisha. Mr. DRI, Mrs. DRI, do you have any documentation proving that these funds were loans or gifts freely given? Tanisha hesitated. They were family contributions, Your Honor. Out of love. Love doesn't usually come with bank transfer receipts labeled loan repayment due. Judge Thorne's tone was icy. Silas handed the judge one final document, a photograph of the vandalized car, keyed with the word, egoist. And finally, Your Honor, this was Ms. DRI's car, vandalized during the course of this dispute. We have a police report and officer testimony confirming the timeline. My client never retaliated, never filed harassment charges. She simply chose to protect herself through lawful means. The judge took a deep breath and looked at Marcus. Mr. DRI, I have been a family court judge for over 15 years, and I can tell when I'm being used. What I see here is not a case of elder manipulation. It's a case of elder exploitation. Marcus swallowed hard, his face pale. Judge Thorne continued, her voice sharp and clear. This court finds no basis for your claim. In fact, I find strong grounds for the defense's counterclaim. Therefore, I am dismissing the plaintiff's case with prejudice and ordering an investigation into possible financial fraud related to your mortgage application. Tanisha gasped audibly. Marcus slumped back in his chair, his expression hollow. Silas leaned toward me and whispered, "You just won, Estelle." But I didn't smile. I didn't feel joy, just a quiet, aching relief. Years of being treated like an invisible servant had finally ended, not with an apology, but with justice. As the bailiff called for recess, Marcus turned to look at me one last time. His eyes were filled not with anger, but with something far more painful.
Fear.
I stood, gathered my papers, and looked at him calmly. "Goodbye, Marcus. Take care of your family without me." Then I walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the first true breath of freedom I'd taken in years. Bank for violating internal confidentiality rules. Though, truthfully, I think she already knew that would happen when she decided to help me. "It was worth it," she told me one morning as we cleaned the espresso machine together. "Some things are more important than keeping a job, like watching someone finally stand up for herself." I pay her fairly, and every Friday we share a slice of lemon cake before closing. She jokes that she traded spreadsheets for cinnamon rolls, and honestly, I think she's happier for it. Silas stops by once a month, usually on his way to court downtown. He always orders the same thing, black coffee, 2 sugars, and sits at the corner table near the window. He insists on paying full price, even though I've tried to give him a discount. "You earned your independence," he says. "Don't start giving it away again." Sometimes on quiet afternoons, I think about Marcus and Tanisha. I haven't heard from them since the restraining order expired. I know they sold the house on Elmwood Avenue, the same house I once fought so hard to save, and moved out of state. Part of me used to wonder if they ever regretted what they did, but I've learned that some questions don't need answers. Last spring, I received a postcard from my granddaughter, Lily.
She's 12 now.
The card had a picture of the ocean and just 3 words written in her careful handwriting. "I miss you, Grandma." I cried when I read it, not from sadness, but from something softer, hope. Maybe one day she'll come visit Robert's Corner. I imagine her sitting by the window, sipping hot chocolate while I tell her stories about the man the cafe was named after. At closing time, when the last chair is turned upside down and the lights are dimmed, I stand behind the counter and take a deep breath. The scent of coffee and baked bread fills the air, a scent that, to me, smells like peace. For the first time in my life, everything I own, everything I build, belongs entirely to me. No signatures, no obligations, no fear. Outside, the city hums softly, cars passing, people laughing, life moving on. I smile, lock the door, and whisper to myself, "Freedom tastes a lot like coffee." ChatGPT said, "ATM mother," as I used to call myself in my darker moments. They don't see me as a source of money or obligation. They see me as a woman who survived something difficult and came out stronger. After lunch, we often walk together to the park nearby. I bring a thermos of coffee and a few slices of leftover cake, and we sit under the oak trees talking about life, faith, and second chances. Sometimes, I catch myself smiling at how ordinary my Sundays have become. No chaos, no guilt, no begging phone calls. Just peace. I think often about the meaning of family. I used to believe it was something you were born into, something unchangeable. But I've learned that family can also be chosen, the people who show up with kindness, not demands, who stand beside you, not above you. Last week, a young woman came into the cafe looking nervous. She had seen my help wanted sign and wanted a job. Her name was Tanya, a single mother with a small boy waiting outside in a stroller. Her story reminded me painfully of who I used to be, tired, overworked, and clinging to the hope that someone might give her a chance. I hired her that same day. She now works mornings with Brenda, and her little boy sometimes sits in the corner eating a muffin while she cleans tables. Watching them gives me a quiet sense of purpose, like all the pain I went through has finally found a way to turn into something good. As the sun sets each evening, I flip the sign on the door to closed, wipe down the counter, and take one last look around. The walls of Robert's corner glow golden in the light, and the faint hum of the espresso machine fades into silence. I whisper a small prayer of gratitude, for peace, for lessons learned, and for the chance to begin again. Because I've realized something simple yet profound. Freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the quiet certainty that you'll never let yourself be bound by them again. And as I lock the door and step into the cool night air, I smile to myself. I may have lost a son, but I found something far more precious, myself. Pie at the park bench. You've spent your whole life giving to others. Now it's your turn to receive. His words stayed with me long after I got home. For years, I'd associated receiving with weakness, as if needing or accepting care meant surrendering control. But now I understand it differently. Sometimes receiving is also an act of grace, allowing others to give sincerely, without debt, without expectation. Mr. Manuel and I have settled into a quiet companionship that feels natural and comforting. There's no pretense, no emotional games, just shared laughter, good coffee, and the steady rhythm of two people who have both known loss but refuse to let it define them. A week later, the Chamber of Commerce ceremony took place. The small auditorium was filled with people, business owners, students, retirees, and local journalists. When the moderator introduced me, I stood at the podium with slightly trembling hands but a calm heart. I used to believe success belonged to the young. I began. That after a certain age, your chances to start over fade away like the evening sun. But I learned that starting over isn't about youth. It's about courage. Courage to stop living for those who take from you and start living for yourself. There was a quiet murmur of agreement in the audience, a few nodding heads, a few smiles of recognition. I thought losing my family was the worst thing that could happen to me, I continued. But sometimes life removes what's hurting you to make room for what's meant for you. I didn't lose my family, I lost my chains. When the applause filled the room, I felt tears rise to my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that I had finally closed a painful chapter of my life. After the ceremony, a young journalist approached me for an interview. "Ms. Dupree," she asked, "if you could give one piece of advice to women your age who feel trapped or afraid to start again, what would it be?" I smiled and said, "Don't wait for permission to take your life back. You already have it." That night, when I returned home, the award plaque gleamed softly under my kitchen light. I placed it on the shelf beside a framed photo of Robert, my late husband, taken decades ago, when we were still full of dreams. For the first time in a long time, I whispered to him, "We made it, Robert. We finally made it." The wind outside carried the faint hum of the city, cars, laughter, life moving on. I poured myself a small cup of tea and looked out the window toward the street where my cafe sign glowed in the distance. Robert's Corner, coffee, community, comfort. I thought of the long journey from pain to peace, from being used to being whole, and realized that my story was no longer about loss. It was about rebirth. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I caught one last glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was no longer afraid. She was living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, your dreams, and your joy. And that, I realized with a full heart, is the truest kind of freedom there is. New Connie.